Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about attachment theory in ADHD. I'll be talking for about 20 minutes, and if you have questions, certainly type them in while I'm talking, or after this has been posted on Facebook or YouTube, you can pose questions there, and I will try to get to them. So the takeaway for those of you who like just a 1-minute talk is that there is fairly extensive validity and support for the basics of attachment theory. And those people with ADHD are both more likely to be raised by parents who have insecure attachment styles themselves, and people with ADHD are more likely to develop insecure patterns themselves of attachment, which does have some influence over long-term relationships and patterns of connecting with other people, but this is not a rigid fixed destiny or saying that someone with ADHD is locked into a pattern which may be less than fulfilling or productive. So that's the takeaway. I'm going to launch into a discussion of what attachment theory is, and then tie that into how it fits in with ADHD. So attachment, and this is my summary, so I accept responsibility for any inaccuracies or overgeneralizations. So British psychologist John Bowlby in the late 50s started developing attachment theory, and it was more thoroughly fleshed out by Mary Ainsworth in the 60s and 70s. And some of the basic tenets or beliefs or claims of attachment theory are that humans are social animals. We have a need for attachment to others, and that infants, little babies, innately seek out other humans. That's a drive that's there, and that's a powerful one. But two, this is not just an unfolding of some innate pattern or instinct that we actually learn from our caregivers, and particularly unlike other piece of information where you might learn from anyone who's out there, particularly our styles of attachment or what an attachment means or what it means to be connected to other people. We learn from our primary caregivers, most commonly mothers, but not always. Three, that there is a critical period for learning this. So if you don't learn this in childhood, it's harder to create it in later life. And particularly or most poignantly that occasionally there's kids who are in such extreme states of deprivation, or sort of the cliched classic raised by wolves scenario, where these children either are under horrific deprivation conditions or raised in a largely non-human setting, have extreme difficulty forming normal human relationships later in life. So fourth point is that these patterns that people develop as infants, in terms of these attachment patterns, are actually good predictors of normal social development and normal emotional development. And when I say predictors, I'm reminding people that we're talking in both biology and, more saliently even in psychology, predictors are general trends and tendencies and likelihoods. So it's not that you have this, you are locked into this type of pattern of development or pattern of attachment, and that there's nothing you can do about it. So again, predictive value just means if you display this trait at point X or this characteristic, you are much more likely to wind up in this group or with these outcomes later in life. So again, it is not a prediction like the laws of physics allow us with much greater precision. I'll not go into quantum mechanics and unpredictably there. So the original theories, both Bowlby and Ainsworth, were focused on infant attachment patterns, but the sort of second generation attachment theory expanded that into that these patterns that you develop as an infant are the patterns you establish for life, and that these are, as an adult, the patterns, the types of attachments you tend to have, again, not are locked into, but tend to have with your peers, tend to have So schoolmates, classmates, tend to have with your coworkers, tend to be the ones you employ in your own romantic relationships, and tend to be the ones you will employ when and if you become a parent yourself. And again, all of these theories have been around for more than almost two-thirds, three-quarters of a century. Particularly in the last few years, there have been some popular books about romantic style, attachment theory, and how it applies to romantic styles, and who you should be looking for and what you can connect with. So that's part of why we're talking about it today, is because the widespread attention and popularity in the last few years. So attachment theory posits that there is a secure attachment style. Again, this is starting out in infants. So with an infant, it's an infant who feels comfortable that parent or other figure is going to be there and taking care of him, which frees him up to explore his environment, which is the developmental task of little kids. And we're talking, a few months to 2 years old stage. So in an adult form, best secure attachment looks like someone who's comfortable with themselves, confident in themselves, is comfortable in their interactions with others, and forming, in general, believing others will behave nicely and positively towards them, and including significantly when people don't treat them that way, they can, with comfort and self-assuredness, remove people like that from the group, so they don't tolerate bad behavior as much as some of these other attachment types. So secure attachments are the commonest pattern we find in different societies. So the Bowlby's and Ainsworth's theories about attachment do seem to have general validity across cultures to the extent they've been looked at. There's certainly many other cultures which are less closely fixated on just a mother-parent bond. So there's certainly collectivist, kibbutzim, and other group raising of babies where babies still develop, again, most commonly secure attachment patterns, and as well as these other, I'll get to the non-secure patterns in a moment. So the non-secure patterns, there were two major types originally, and then a third was added in. So the avoidant pattern are mostly, the avoidance is a reaction to the parent figure, the caregiver, being rejecting at times, and the avoidant baby masks its distress by pretending not care, not to be excited when they've been separated briefly and see the parent again. They just affect a nonchalance or indifference to what's going on. When you look at physiologic markers, heart rate and others, that baby clearly is distressed, but it's covering it up pretty well. And similarly, in adult life, of that avoidant pattern looks like people who are sort of focused on their own life, focused on their own chores and tasks, not particularly seeking out contact, social connections from others, and being somewhat oblivious, not easily influenced by how others are acting around them. So more remote and distant and independent, but less firmly connected at a social, emotional level. The second major insecure pattern was an anxious, and also called an anxious ambivalent pattern, and that was, studies suggested, largely a response to unpredictability on the part of the caregiver. The caregiver was sometimes attentive and present in attending to the baby's needs, and sometimes not. And the anxious ambivalent babies responded, when reconnected with their parents after a brief absence, with anger outbursts or helpless, fussy, whiny, crying, sort of despair. So extreme emotional displays, which sort of hooked in the parent to responding, but not always responding in a warm, empathic, supportive way. So both with the avoidant and the anxious styles among infants, measurably those children explore their own environment less extensively because again, the thought is that they don't have a sense of security to go looking at the rest of the world. The avoidant person does it by making the world just what's here in front of them. And again, so the third major type of insecure behavior is called the disorganized behavior, and that's thought to be a response to environments, parenting, caregivers that are so dangerous that the baby sort of concludes that the best thing is to do is to not connect at all. So it's not even sort of passively sitting there pretending it doesn't care what the parent does. It's not anxiously clinging and or out angrily clinging, having outbursts. It's more fearful, withdrawal, avoiding, but again in a different way than the avoidant group. So how does this connect at all to ADHD? There's a number of different studies that pretty consistently suggest, that indicate, again, that children who have ADHD are more likely to have had parenting styles that were non-secure themselves, so they dealt with parents who were either avoidant or anxious or disorganized or inconsistent. And again, in terms of looking at the infants with ADHD who go on to develop ADHD, insecure styles are predominant, or certainly more common than in the general population. So less secure patterns and more insecure ones. It's not that there's nobody with ADHD who has a secure pattern, it's just less frequent than kids without ADHD. So a few other things along the lines that sort of line up with attachment theory. There's a host of evidence that shows that parents who are more rejecting, parents who are more violent, parents that are more volatile, parents that are less supportive, a whole host of what we'd say adverse parenting styles are associated with more severity of ADHD symptoms as a kid grows up. And conversely, there have been studies looking at treating the parents and either giving parenting classes and or if the parents themselves have ADHD, sometimes as simply as treating their ADHD with medication can have a positive effect on their developing proto-ADHD or early ADHD child, and at least in a few studies actually change the attachment style, so a greater likelihood that the child will develop a secure, even the child with ADHD will develop a secure attachment style if the parent is effectively treated for their ADHD or other problems. So some of the other research in general with attachment styles suggests that as long as you have one person with the secure attachment style in a relationship, you're likely to do well. So the two secure people together, again, are both confident in themselves, comfortable with sharing emotionally and socially, and comfortable when there are disagreements, communicating about them and expressing themselves and allowing room for the other person to express themselves. And again, this is the non-ADD world. In the non-ADD world, there's a fair amount of data that even just having one person in the relationship with a secure attachment style has pretty good predictive value for a generally satisfactory and long-lived relationship, romantic relationship. There's also been some evidence that people with anxious styles tend to seek out or do better with avoidant styles. And in the ADHD world, there's at least one study that suggested that if the partner of someone with ADHD is an avoidant style, that worked much better than the partner who had an anxious style. So the inconsistencies, the inattention at some time, over-attention at others, the forgetfulness, the difficulty staying on track, the maybe more emotional volatility was handled better by a partner with an avoidant style than a partner with an anxious, ambivalent style. So some of the objections or counter arguments to the whole attachment theory approach is that separate from what you've learned, so attachment theory again is all about what you've learned from your parents, there are very clearly large temperamental factors, including temperamental factors, biological, genetic factors, which predispose to anxiety, predispose to certain styles of viewing yourself and styles of viewing the world and interacting with the world. And again, with almost everything in psychiatry, psychology, human development, it's clearly not all nurture, all nature. Both are taking a role. And I would say in almost everything, they both take hugely important and large roles. So it's often not that helpful to argue which is bigger. They're both having a role. But the critics of attachment theory and particularly lament that it seems to emphasize you learn everything, not just in kindergarten, you learn everything way before kindergarten in terms of how you interact with others, and not much else can change it. That simplified version clearly isn't so. The second sort of major criticism is that even though we have rating scales and ways of putting people in these boxes, and the paradigm for testing is having a kid, young infant in a room, having their parent go away, having a stranger be present, seeing how the kid reacts, both the strangers and novelty, and then how the kid reacts when the parent rejoins after minutes later. So we have scoring systems, we have ways of putting people in these nice little boxes. Clearly, lots of people don't fit in those nice little boxes, and people fit in one boxes, even infants at one time and at a different time, although there does tend to be some stability, some replicability to these studies for an individual. There's a variety of other factors that can be going on that can affect how someone's attachment style. So what else can I say? I'd say that's about all I'll say for today. So again, the bottom line, even though these patterns do seem to be pervasive, I'll use a quote from one of my very first psychiatry professors, and his phrase was, "The past participates." So how you were treated is going to have a large role in how you will treat yourself and treat others. But it's not the only factor, and the more you can become aware of how what your own patterns are, first what they are, and then two, how they develop, then you have greater ability to try to change them if you desire to change them. So that's what I'll say for today, and next week's talk is what I was going to talk about a month ago in terms of ADHD and pregnancy. So that'll be on October 1st. Have a safe and happy week, and I will be back next week.